The ayes are 68, the noes 51. Part 1 as amended will stand part. The question now is that Part 2 stand part. Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Speaker, Part 2 of this bill really surrounds the nature of the formula and the departures from that formula. Part 1, covered the formula in detail, so we actually debated the merits of the more complex formula that's been introduced and the disadvantages of transparency and so forth around that, and the way in which children are not put at the heart of the legislation. Part 2 focuses more nearly on exemptions, on departures from the formula and how they should be treated. And one of the things that particularly concerned me in the Select Committee process was around the automatic deduction provisions that were introduced quite late in the piece in the Select Committee process, whereby employers could be asked by the Inland Revenue to deduct from wages money owed in child support payments. Now, I should say from the outset that the Labor Party absolutely supports collecting the debts that are rightly owed. We believe that liable parents have a responsibility to care for the children that they are responsible for, and so we support in principle the strengthening of a regime for collection. However, in this case, what we see, or what we saw at least in the Select Committee, was that the department had not yet worked through quite how this would work. They had not thought through the natural justice processes in terms of notifying the person who was likely to have their salary deducted, nor had they thought through perhaps some of the cultural implications where perhaps for whatever reason best known to those who had the child support debt, they had chosen not to tell their employer that they had a debt, probably for fear of discrimination of one kind or another, or perhaps even not told their employer that they had children for whom they were responsible, possibly for fear of discrimination of one kind or another. We felt that while the state has an obligation to collect that debt, that there ought to at least be a process of warning the person that was going to be put in place. That there should be a means for letting them know that the state was about to take this action, and should they wish to cough up, that they could at that point do it, or make arrangements, or contact the Commissioner of the Inland Revenue and ask for some kind of other arrangement. Now, I have every faith, after some of the discussions with those officials, that they will attempt to address these natural justice concerns. We were very fortunate, I have to say, to have some excellent officials briefing the committee who listened well and who came back with suggestions around our concerns, and I believe we were very well served as a committee. What I don't think is that the government itself and the minister in charge had thought that matter through fully. And so we felt, as on the Labor Party side, that it was very important to keep a close eye on how this is implemented. And we are very hopeful that the Minister will take this on board in terms of the practical arrangements for pursuing this debt. But it is one of the areas where you end up, Mr Speaker, not you, but where one can end up if these things are not taken special care around. We can end up with some unintended consequences. And another potential unintended consequence of this, which it became clear the government hadn't considered, was in terms of the additional compliance costs on business. And this is something of a pattern we've seen with this government, whereby additional costs are heaped upon business, which is not a big deal if you're a large business owner and you've got automated systems. But for many small business owners, the additional compliance, we think back to the paperboy tax and the cleaners who now are required to report their earnings through the system, and the extra overheads on schools and others who manage these people in part-time work. We see a pattern where the National Party doesn't consult business. It talks about business a lot, that's true, it talks about business a lot, but it always seems to favour big business. And there's nothing wrong with big business, in my view, but little business in the National Party is often ignored and trampled upon without concern about the additional overheads that a piece of legislation like this could have. Now, we know that when an employer collects this extra money off their employee, suddenly they become responsible for some personal information, which, if a grievance suddenly takes place in the workplace, they may be accused of having used them properly. We have a whole lot of complexities introduced to the workplace that were not there before. And these things are things that businesses were not consulted on. And so, Mr. Speaker,
David Clark.
And so there are again some natural justice issues here, and some on top of the additional overheads that have been put on business and the additional compliance costs for business that is introduced in this legislation. So these are some of the potential unintended consequences. I was surprised that things could be introduced so late in the piece. Without having been through the proper consultation process that I would expect of a piece of legislation that had been proposed for several years, that seemed to be not a priority for the government, and suddenly has become a priority for the government. So we see a somewhat unfluid production of the legislation. Now, the other thing in here is around that I think is important to comment on at this stage. In my second call, if I get further calls, I'll have some more that I want to say, but particularly around the penalties for late payment for debts. I think that the government is taking a sensible step here in making the obligations more likely to be met. We have a trade-off here because, in one sense, what is going on is that liable fathers are now liable for a whole lot less. And so there's a question about personal responsibility. And the National Party is saying effectively that those who have many children have now less liability and less personal responsibility for the children that they have produced. Now that's an interesting position for the National Party to take. And yet, in some ways, I think they're right. If this leads to us collecting more of the debt and to the debt not spiralling out of control, then surely that is a good thing, because there is $2 billion outstanding in child support payments. And that's something that this government has needed to address. For some reason, it's not been a priority for the last 4 years, that there's $2 billion worth of child support debt outstanding. But it is good that it appears that it will be addressed in some way in this legislation. Again, how that is implemented, and that's around discretion of the Commissioner and so on, will be very interesting to keep a close eye on. So, Mr. Speaker, in terms of this legislation, the other issue that comes out of these additional compliance costs that National is putting on business and that comes out of the natural justice concerns is the additional cost of administering the formula, and with it the exemptions. So we know that this formula will cost more to administer. The IRD officials have told us that it's already the most expensive part of the legislation, the most expensive piece of legislation that they have to administer on a per case basis. And so we know that this is a cost on government. And because it's people in difficult circumstances, of course, we think it's reasonable that there should be a cost. But we are concerned about the additional cost introduced by a complex formula, and with it, some more additionally complex, one can imagine, exemptions coming out of it. The Commissioner's discretion will in some ways, I'm sure, deal with some of those things, but on a day-to-day basis there are going to be more staff involved in working out how the formula is applied and how also when it's not applied. You know, the staff time to implement the formula is expected to be more. That's what the officials said. And so, you know, it's reasonable to expect that working out when it doesn't apply and how you work around the new formula is also going to take more time. So there's more overhead involved for government, and you know, effectively that means increased bureaucracy. So there's increased bureaucracy that comes from having a more complex formula, and also from the exemptions that fall from that formula. So I will end my contribution to this particular part right at the moment, because I'm sure other speakers are very keen to speak. However, I intend or hope to take some more calls on this part in the legislation, because there are a couple more areas that I wish to speak that are separate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mike Saban.
Mr. Chair, pleased to take a call. The second part largely dealing